Film number 5, The True Cost. As the film The True Cost makes clear, people in wealthy countries consume an extraordinary amount of stuff. And it's not just clothing, but all sorts of stuff, from small stuff like smartphones to big stuff like cars. Incidentally, my country, the United States, is a world leader when it comes to consuming stuff. Environmentally, this is a double-edged sword, with each side harming both people and the earth. First, all of this stuff is made of natural resources. A smartphone, for example, is made of dozens and dozens of different materials. Some of them, like the cobalt used for the battery, cause significant social and environmental justice problems through their mining, which directly harms workers, including, in some cases, children working in mines, as well as the environment by contaminating the air, the land, the water, and so forth. Second, making stuff requires an enormous amount of energy, which in turn emits greenhouse gases. The manufacture of an automobile releases more than a dozen tons of carbon dioxide or equivalent gases into the atmosphere. Some luxury SUVs are responsible for 3 times as much, and that's about 35 metric tons of CO2. So just who is responsible for all this? Is it consumers? Or is it the companies that manufacture all this stuff? A variety of corporations and their advocates have long argued that we consumers are the problem. After all, they argue, they just make what we want. If we didn't want it, they wouldn't make it, and there wouldn't be a problem. Consequently, since we are the problem, in this way of thinking, it's up to us to address this issue. If we really want to do something about it, then we should simply stop buying, or at least become minimalists. So, it sounds simple enough. As we consumers are to blame, it's up to us to solve the problem that we've created. But are we to blame? Something to think about is that corporations have long been in the business of making consumers out of ordinary people. Ideally, insatiable, rampant consumers. It sounds a little like the Matrix, doesn't it? But corporations are in the business of making us into the beings that serve them best, consumers. Unfortunately, neither we nor the earth are much served by this enterprise. To the contrary, it can be incredibly detrimental to our species and our planet, as well as other species with which we share the earth. In order to help explain why, and how all this works, allow me to repeat a story that I included in my most recent book on writing a new environmental era and moving forward to nature. So quite a few years ago, while visiting friends, I noticed that their young daughter, who was 6 or 7 at the time, was watching TV. Glancing over from time to time, it was obvious that the show was geared toward young girls. What caught my attention were the ads. Most were selling what you would expect. Toys, sugared breakfast cereals, a local theme park, that sort of thing. One ad, however, was of another sort of beast altogether. It was for a major cosmetic corporation showing models having fun on looked like a Caribbean beach. It repeatedly cut to scenes of them applying makeup, which they were having a frolicsome good time doing. Realizing that this ad was running on a show pitched at young girls, I waited to see how it would end. Were they really trying to sell lipstick to 6-year-olds? As it turns out, they weren't. The ad was not designed to sell a particular product, but rather to sell a brand that makes a broad range of products. It was really just 60 seconds of young women made happy by cosmetics, made happy by a particular brand of cosmetics. So, were they trying to get 6-year-olds to switch to their brand of eyeliner? If they really were trying to sell cosmetics to young girls, you would expect that at least some of the models would have been, children. Why were they instead just young women on screen? After all, thinking about it, the frightening answer hit me like a ton of bricks. The cosmetic industry, this particular company, decided that they needed to make more than just cosmetics. Astonishingly, they had also taken up the business of making consumers. First, they present girls with images of happy and appealing young women. Next, they cut to the source of the happiness, applying and wearing makeup. There is no suggestion that young girls themselves should be wearing the makeup. Instead, it's held up as an essential part of what it is to be a woman. It may take a decade or more, but by repeatedly and subtly suggesting to girls that the road to womanhood is paved with cosmetics, a generation of consumers is created whose very sense of self, and in this case, of course, a gendered self, depends on the products on offer. With so much at stake, and indeed, the fragile emerging self-identity of a human being, the desire to have and fear of being without the product becomes extraordinarily important as it is presented as an essential part of a happy and successful adulthood. Although we may think that industries exist to serve us by providing all sorts of appealing consumer goods like cosmetics, it is arguably the other way around. Human beings exist to serve these corporations. Human consumption is what empowers them. An enormous amount of care and attention is thus given to fashioning human beings willing to work long hours, making disposable income and willing to make sacrifices in the bargain, such as by not having time for family and friends, so that these industries can survive. It really does sound a little like The Matrix, doesn't it? As I noted back in our discussion of Henry David Thoreau's Walden, today the project has been profoundly ramped up as girls and young women are themselves recruited to help create this new generation of consumers. They do so by first cultivating a following on social media. Once this trend-setting young woman has a sufficient number of viewers on YouTube, she can monetize this achievement by, for example, selling cosmetics on her channel. In this sense, the project comes full circle, as the trendsetter herself was arguably fashioned by the cosmetic industry for that role. It's kind of bizarre, right? But ironically, you may view having been conscripted by the cosmetic industry as a great personal achievement. And maybe it was, as girls and young women are certainly encouraged to look up to individuals of that sort. Of course, all sorts of industries are in this business, and that certainly doesn't involve just girls and young women. That's just my example. It happens with boys and young men and all sorts of people, although with different products. For example, certain cars are marketed to men with great success. More than 4 out of 5 purchasers of the Chevrolet Corvette are men. Sort of macho car. In both cases, marketers hope that they can exploit our insecurities, so they provide a way for us to believe that we can become more attractive, either by way of more something like cosmetics, or more powerful by purchasing a muscle car. And of course, there are plenty of products that are not gendered in their marketing. The film The True Cost shows us the ugly underside of this consumption machine, which is disaster for both us, human beings, and the planet, as well as for the people making our clothes. In terms of clothing, the average American purchases over 60 new items of clothing every year, not including essentials like socks and underwear. Thus, although we consumers are seemingly the ones that benefit by all this, it is the corporations selling us all this stuff that really profit. Our job is to buy, briefly wear, and then dispose, and repeat the process, and repeat it again. While The True Cost focuses on the fashion industry, the ramped-up consumerism impacts all sorts of products. And incidentally, 150 years ago, Henry David Thoreau desperately tried to convince us of the truth of all this when he argued that the goal of the clothing industry was, quote, not that mankind may be well and honestly clad, but unquestionably that the corporations may be enriched. So, at the risk of repeating myself, just who is responsible for all this? Is it us consumers or the companies that manufacture all this stuff? Thoreau certainly thought that the industry was principally to blame. I'm curious what people make of all this. Do you agree with Thoreau? Have we been given a glimpse inside of the fast fashion industry? Having been given a glimpse inside the fast fashion industry by The True Cost, what is your response? While this film is about the fashion industry, are other industries now following suit? In other words, in addition to fast fashion, do we now have things like fast consumer electronics? The episode of Patriot Act on the ugly truth of fast fashion provides an interesting supplement to the true cost. Although it doesn't shockingly take us inside of the fashion industry as the true cost did, scenes from like the Rana Plaza disaster, this Patriot Act episode nonetheless makes it seems to me, an effective critique of fast fashion. However, what I find particularly interesting here is the format. At 1/3 of the length of the true cost, quite a bit has to be crammed into this episode, yet it does not feel rushed. And, of course, it manages to make us laugh out loud in spite of the horrific subject material. To me, this episode of Patriot Act raises an important question. How should we go about informing the public of issues like this? A full-length documentary, like The True Cost, is a traditional and I would argue nonetheless great approach. But it's not without its shortcomings, as it may not attract a huge audience. It takes a lot of time to watch. So should we be experimenting with other ways of getting the message out, like the biting comedy of the Patriot Act? Any other ideas for spreading the message? Class discussion of The True Cost. In this, note the following observations, which I usually do. That I have not paraphrased or altered any of these coming comments, though the occasional typo, has been fixed and because of space concerns shortened. Often just part of the comment is reproduced here along with my reply. In working through these, I will first quote a student's observation, followed by my thoughts. So the first comment. Every single employee deserves a livable wage, trade union rights, pension, safe working conditions, and health care. However, the numerous disasters, including the collapse of the Rana Plaza and factory fires, show how little greedy corporations care. The less money these corporations spend on infrastructure and employee benefits, the more profit is made for a small group of people at the top. My mother, who immigrated to the U.S. 2 decades ago, has experienced working in garment factories in both China and San Diego. She talked about the poor living conditions, not making enough to eat, the long hours, and the strict management. The treatment of garment factory workers makes me awfully angry. The poorest people in the world who face innumerable struggles and can't afford the necessities in life, and that would be shelter, food, healthcare, etc. Support the selfish lifestyles for the rest of the world. And what makes it even worse is that most people don't know where their clothes come from. The problem with American culture is that people have insatiable desires for more and the need to meet unrealistically high standards. Instead of buying quality, fair trade clothing for a higher cost that will last longer, Americans go towards purchasing cheap clothing that is made to be worn a few times and disposed of. The cheap clothing that comes from mothers who can't afford to care for their children, and cotton farmers who face the health consequences from pesticides. Wow, what an incredibly powerful statement. And it's all true, squarely on the mark. Every single employee on the planet deserves a living wage, trade union rights, pension, safe working conditions, and health care. The International Trade Union Confederation, that's the ITUC, has global rights impact for 139 countries against 97 recognized indicators to assess whether workers' rights are being protected in law and practice. Basically, the ITUC has created 5 tiers in order to clarify where workers are most protected. Scoring a 1, the top score, are countries like Norway and Denmark, where rights violations are not a regular occurrence. Next down are countries like Japan and Switzerland, where repeated violations of rights occur. The third tier down includes China and Ghana, which have regular violations of rights. At the very bottom, in the 5th tier, are countries like Bangladesh and Nigeria, where there are no guarantee of rights. You may have noticed that I skipped a tier, the 4th from the second from the bottom, number 4, right above Bangladesh and Nigeria. In these countries, there are systemic violations of rights. There are 77 countries that rank above these Tier 4 countries. Tier 4 countries include Kenya and the United States. It may seem like garment workers in San Diego, like this person's mother, would have their rights protected more than in Paraguay, Namibia, or Ghana, but this is simply not the case. Moreover, this person's mother would statistically have experienced fewer human rights violations back in China than she did when she arrived in San Diego. Hence, while we might hope that a made in USA garment ensures that workers who made the product do not have their rights violated, this is hardly a guarantee. After watching The True Cost, we might think that these rights violations happen far from home. However, they are widespread in the U.S. as well. One can imagine a sequel film titled something like The True Cost, the U.S. Story, which would take us inside of garment factories in the United States. In many ways, it would be as poignant as the original film. So, the next quote. While watching The True Cost, it made me suddenly wary of the impact just one person can have on climate change. I think that we all, to an extent, think that we are just one person and we can't contribute so largely to a widespread problem. Though the reality is that we are individually damaging the climate. Watching this film, I knew about the impact that I make on the environment by way of everyday choices, but seeing it is a whole different story. My family is from India, and I have visited there often, so I have seen these horrific labor circumstances firsthand, making them far more impactful to me. India has a large population of overexerted laborers, though most of what they make is for export purposes. End of the quote. There are a number of great interconnected points here. First, in terms of workers' rights, India is also near the very bottom with Bangladesh, in the 5th tier, which is where there are no guarantees of rights. As this person aptly notes, most of what they make is for export purposes, which is the case with so many countries such as Bangladesh and China. Consequently, even though it may seem that The True Cost is about the horrible working conditions in far-off places like Bangladesh and Cambodia, it's also about the U.S. and our insatiable consumerism. Indeed, that could have made for an illuminating supplement to the film's title, as it could well have been called The True Cost of Our Insatiable Consumerism on the Rest of the World and the Planet. In this sense, the film holds a mirror up to us. While we can, and absolutely should, be outraged at the corporations that directly exploit people in Bangladesh and Cambodia, some of the anger should be turned in on ourselves, as these companies are doing it for us. Of course, none of us are authorizing these corporations to violate the rights of people across the planet. However, when we buy things like shirts that cost $5 or $10, yet are sewn by hand, we need to realize that we are enabling a system that does just that. To again repeat the previous comment, every single employee deserves a livable wage, trade union rights, pension, safe working conditions, and health care at a minimum. There is simply no way that this can be achieved while producing a shirt that retails for $5. However, this comment raises the question of the impact that just one person can have. We are sometimes told that individual action does little, as it is just a drop in the bucket. For example, why shouldn't we get on that airplane, as it will take off regardless of whether our seat is filled or not? However, if 200 people do this, it will mean that one less flight will happen. Individual action is part of the equation, but it is never, but as I never tire of saying, it has to be coupled with activism and political action. In this case, laws need to be enacted across the planet to protect the rights of workers, as well as to protect the planet itself. Although we might think that this only applies to places like Bangladesh and Cambodia, as I noted, we need major reform in the United States as well. Incidentally, paying a little more for a product does not ensure that more money goes to the people who actually make it. iPhones are an example. Let's assume that an iPhone costs $1,000, which is in fact a little less than the base cost of Apple's current top-of-the-line model. What percentage of this cost do you think goes to the people who actually make the phone? 10%? 20%? 30%? In fact, just 2% of the cost of an iPhone goes to the workers who make it, just $20. It might seem that because of this such a high-tech device, most of the $1,000 would go to the components. However, 51%, and that's $510 in our example, the cost goes to the profit for Apple. And since Apple is already wildly profiting company, if they reduce the amount of the purchase price that goes to the profit by just 2%, they could double the amount that goes to workers. Think about that for a moment. Apple could double the amount of what is going to workers with an almost negligible impact on their profits. Yet they don't. So just how bad are the working conditions in the factories that make iPhones? Starting around the year 2010, the number of deaths by suicide in Foxconn plants to produce iPhones became so great that the company had large nets installed outside of many of the buildings to catch the falling bodies. Next quote. I learned about the horrific factory workers' conditions in my world history class as well. There was an incident the professor mentioned that was similar to the Rana Plaza collapse that happened during the Industrial Revolution in the spring of 1911. A fire broke out in the Triangle Shirtwaist Company. The company was one of the largest garment factories in the east side of Manhattan. There were 146 Jewish and Italian young women working at the time that were trapped inside of the 9th floor of the factory. All 146 of those women burned to death, asphyxiated, or jumped to their deaths. The sad truth is that the fashion industry hasn't really changed since the Industrial Revolution. There have been so many deaths that have occurred inside of these factories, and nothing has happened to correct that. The fast fashion industry still exists, and people are still dying because of the exploitation of this industry. And it is humane, unjust, and destroys the planet. So this is a really important point. Although fast fashion is relatively new, the problem of workers' rights is not. During the 1911 fire at the Triangle Shirtwaist factory that this person references, the 146 women were not just, as this person notes, trapped inside the 9th floor of the factory. They were locked in, as the doors to the stairwells and exits were locked, which was a common practice at the time to prevent workers from taking unauthorized breaks and to reduce theft. Yeah. The 1911 fire at the Triangle Shirtwaist factory proved to be something of a watershed event in workers' rights in the United States, as public outcry inspired workplace safety laws that revolutionized industrial work nationwide. One of the people who witnessed the fire, Frances Perkins, subsequently helped organize and implement reforms, later becoming President Roosevelt's labor secretary and the first female cabinet member in the United States. Perkins later said that the fire was the day that the New Deal was born. So the next quote. The true cost really made me rethink the harms of the fashion industry. Living in South Korea, fashion is a great influencer among all people, determining a critical view of wealth, appearance, and general well-being. People in Korea take fashion seriously and regularly change their clothes according to trend, accurately portraying fast fashion. I believe that this documentary holds an important message that Koreans must understand before taking too much value of clothing. Yeah. Another great point. Although we may think of fast fashion as a U.S. phenomenon, something that is part and parcel with, the so-called American dream, this dream has now spread around the world. As this comment aptly notes, fashion has taken on a symbolic role as a critical indicator of wealth, appearance, and even general well-being. People in Korea, as well as the rest of the planet, take fast fashion seriously and regularly change their clothes according to trend. Although, in some sense, it has taken centuries, the fact that the fashion industry has yoked our very sense of self with the clothes that we wear is an astonishing achievement on their part, especially as it is now a worldwide phenomenon. Of course, clothes have always played a symbolic role, but it was globally never mass-marketed to such an extent, and arguably so successfully. Instead of looking and listening carefully for signs of inner General well-being, we have been trained to see clothing as an indicator of health and happiness, as well as prosperity. Of course, even if you think about it just a little, it's obvious that this is not, it's not in any way such an indicator. Moreover, now that fast fashion has driven the cost of clothing down, it no longer functions as an accurate indicator of wealth. And yet, it continues to have a symbolic importance, which marketers are happy to continue to promote and exploit. So the next quote. This week, watching the 30-minute episode of The Ugly Truth of Fast Fashion was really refreshing. Its humorous approach delivered important information in a friendly format that was easy to receive. And yet, all of the information was a giant slap in the face of just how horrible fast fashion really is. Even though Hassan would joke about the actual ridiculousness of a society that has 52 fashion seasons per year, he didn't take any of the seriousness away from the issue. In fact, just when viewers started to think that maybe the problems weren't as bad as they seemed, he brought down some undeniable statistic that really made the audience think. As a person who has trouble getting people to care about some of the things that I think are important, it was almost revolutionary for me to watching this documentary, that this comedian could get just about anyone to stop and pay attention to such an important issue like fast fashion. It's the end of the quote. So how indeed do you get people caring about issues that are important, such as the climate crisis? One option is to entertain them while explaining the issue. Perhaps surprisingly, entertaining through comedy can prove to be surprisingly effective. However, this can be a dicey business, as going too far can make the whole thing seem like a laughing matter, not something that, you would want to do with the climate crisis. Alternately, baiting people with the promise of entertainment only to hit them with some really disturbing information could, make them want to, cause them to turn the show right off. Shows like Patriot Act last week with John Oliver and The Daily Show have worked at perfecting a satirical approach to important issues with short comedic interludes that really seems to work. Not all the time, but often. Consequently, the host of Patriot Act was able to, as this person's comment notes, joke about the actual ridiculousness of a society that has 52 fast fashion seasons a year, yet it didn't take away any of the seriousness from the issue. Regarding the notion that there are now 52 fashion seasons per year instead of the original fall and spring seasons from a generation ago, it may seem ludicrous that stores would need to replenish their stock on a weekly basis. However, as the following comment notes, there may indeed be more than one shipment in a week. So, next quote. I worked in clothing retail at a mid-range department store, Macy's, if you care to know. When Hassan says that drowning in clothes as the model for fast fashion industry, I had a vivid flashback to spending hours upon hours in the docks, unpacking clothes, stripping off plastic bags, and hanging, folding, and adding sensors to garments. We received 2 shipments of clothing per week, plus whatever trucks came randomly. I couldn't imagine anything selling at a rate to warrant how many articles we put out on the floor, but people bought it. Everyone is ravenous for cheap clothing. Everyone believes in the fundamental right to express themselves through their fashion choices. It's unbelievable. It's the end of the quote. It's interesting to think about there being a fundamental right to express ourselves through fashion choices. I don't recall that being in the U.S. Constitution. Yet, as this person rightly notes, many people seem to believe that this is one of their rights. This must be enormously rewarding for marketers, as people have been turned into consumers who believe that they have the right to buy as much as they want in order to express themselves. As I noted earlier, our very sense of self has been interwoven into what we wear. no pun intended. What is rather surprising is that fast fashion has sold us on the idea that quantity rather than quality matters. In fact, marketers have convinced us to wear poor quality clothing in order that we may have more of it. Traditionally, and by that I mean up until roughly the middle of the 20th century, well-off women in wealthy countries had just 5 or 6 dresses, and men as many suits. In order to add variety to the look, people wore things like interesting scarves and neckties. Although people didn't own many items of clothing, these were generally of relatively high quality and carefully tailored to the individual. In the U.S., most people wore clothes made in the U.S. Exploiting the fact that garments could be made less expensively in other countries, the American clothing industry entered a period of swift decline starting 50 years ago. Although unfortunate for the U.S. clothing industry, this meant that more and more people in the U.S. could have more and more clothing. In other words, you didn't have to be wealthy to have 5 or 6 nice outfits. Soon, nearly anyone could, which meant that marketers suddenly had a much larger market than just relatively well-off individuals. And, as has been able to continue to drive costs down over the past few decades, this meant that people could buy more and more articles of clothing. So the next quote. When someone mentions climate change, the first issue that pops up in our heads are probably rising sea levels, polar ice caps melting, coal mining, oil rigging, or global temperature rise. It would be unlikely for the fast fashion industry to make it to that list. Yet little do we know, the fast fashion industry is the second most polluting industry after oil. How did I not know this? That's the end of the quote. It's true. When we think about climate crisis, we often think about the consequences, like rising sea level rises, polar ice caps melting, or root causes like coal mining and drilling for oil. We do not, however, often think about our own personal actions and the industries, like fashion, encouraging environmentally worrisome, disastrous practices. Although we might not think much about its climate footprint, the fashion industry is responsible for 10% of annual global greenhouse gas emissions. When you consider that many people in wealthy countries like the U.S. are literally purchasing 10 times more clothing than they need, you can see how cutting back on this rampant consumerism could result in immediate and significant reductions in global greenhouse gas emissions. It's unfortunately the case that now that the climate crisis is increasingly on our radar, we forget that there are all sorts of environmental problems caused by industry, such as polluting of land, air, and water, and this is by certain industries. The fashion industry is a prime offender here. For example, around 20% of wastewater worldwide comes from fabric dyeing and treatment. The silver lining here is that this is something that we can tackle right now. We do not, for example, need technological breakthroughs to tackle this problem. Of course, technological innovations are always welcome. For example, textile mills generate 1/5 of the world's industrial water pollution. There is promising new technology that can reduce the water used to produce garments. However, even greater gains can be had by approaching this as a cultural problem, which is what we do in this class. After all, since 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from the fashion industry, we could easily cut this in half if we all purchased half as many clothes, everything else being equal. Moreover, as social justice and environmental issues are deeply interwoven here, by addressing the climate crisis as a cultural rather than technological problem, we can implement solutions that will improve both.